No way. In the conference room of my lawyer, I waiting. In the 5 years after I had hired him, not much had changed. The wall artwork, furnishings, and even the National Geographic magazine in the corner end table are all the same. It's kind of depressing to think that he could have purchased an eternity subscription with all the money I had previously given him. Fortunately, I was alone in the room, so this wasn't even close to his hourly charge. If I wasn't going to use a lawyer, then why was I in their office? That was a thoughtful question, then. The quick answer is that it's due of my former wife, Stella Jefferson. She had been attempting to call me for the last few weeks, but she had not been successful. Her tendency to introduce me to justice, divorce style, was the reason she never succeeded. Any unapproved communication with Stella would result in police and court hearings, a lesson I had to learn the hard way. When she persuaded me to meet with her to discuss some child custody concerns while the divorce was still pending, she truly converted me into her believer. Since we had our dinner there and I had proposed to her there, I was expecting that when I arrived at the restaurant where she wanted to meet, it would be auspicious. I was hoping against all common sense that she was feeling reconciled. All I wanted was my wife and family back, even after all the hurt and embarrassment she had brought upon me. I was wearing a sport jacket and tie for the fancy restaurant, so I was looking for her in the bustle of the place with much anticipation. At last, I caught sight of her sitting at a corner table, staring out the window. Perhaps she was waiting for me to get here. I approached her table after pointing her out to the hostess. Her beauty still captivated me. Given how tall and statuesque she appeared in her little black dress, it was hard to believe that this brunette was a mother of 2 children. As I walked up, she was the picture of elegance. I was about to take a seat at the table when she noticed me moving and looked at me. Her beautiful face became icy and spiteful, which baffled me. Numerous folks approached our table before I could say hi or inquire as to what was wrong. When I told them I was under arrest for breaking a temporary restraining order imposed by the court overseeing our divorce case, 2 uniformed police officers questioned if I was John Perry. I objected that she had called me to meet her, but I was ordered to speak with the judge about it. I was not to communicate with her without the court's approval, according to the very clear court order. This was due to her accusation that I had physically mistreated her and the kids, and her concern for their safety if I wasn't kept at bay. When I first opened the divorce pleadings that I had been served, I was astounded. She had filed for divorce before me, and when I read through all the lies she and her lawyer had written, she had adopted a no-holds-barred strategy. In the end, the judge decided that I posed a risk to my wife and kids' safety and that she would be the only one to decide whether or not I would see them again. The majority of people probably don't realize how embarrassing getting arrested can be. While I was chained behind my back and physically twisted over the table, I noticed a small youngster flinching away from a nearby table. I wanted to tell him I wasn't a horrible person, but how do you strike up a conversation like that? Being dragged out of the building and into the back of a police cruiser wouldn't have given me time to provide my explanation. I insisted on my innocence to the officers the entire trip. They drove to the municipal jail, still ignoring me. I guess they'd heard it all before and they just ignored me all the time. I was then registered and given access to the facility. After providing my fingerprints and mugshot, I was prompted to provide details like my name, place of employment, address, and vital statistics. I answered all of their questions, hoping for a chance to clarify what had transpired. Rather, I was directed to a general holding cell where roughly 50 men were idly moving around. Wait a minute, don't I get a phone call? How do I see about getting bonded out? I asked before I was escorted inside. The police sergeant patiently explained, a phone is brought around each morning for inmates' use. You can make any local call. If you call long distance, the party you call will have to accept the charges before you are connected. As far as bond, you are charged with being in contempt of the judge's order. Therefore, you will have to appear before the judge before you can even think about being released. And since today is Friday, you won't be scheduled to appear in court until Monday at the earliest. The sound of the cell door's steel clang and the key's latch reverberated against the dank, cold concrete walls as he forcefully shoved me inside. I hunkered up on the floor, found a space against the wall, and wrote out the 3 days without making eye contact with anyone. Really, there aren't enough words to express how it feels to be there. Over the weekend, individuals from many walks of life were there. They were hardened criminals, gangbangers, frat boys in college, intoxicated, addicted, and sometimes even good citizens like me. The noise remained a disruptive flow due to the ebb and flow of new individuals entering and people leaving after forming a bond. There was a hierarchy for everything. It made no difference if it was for eating, making phone calls, or even receiving a blanket. The antisocial personalities would target the most vulnerable people and provoke them into a brawl, forcing the police to step in, transport the victims to a medical facility, and scatter the attackers into a nearby detention cell designated for violent offenders. As I was dressed, I got some attention during the course of the 3 days. Everyone must have assumed that if I could afford to dress that way, I ought to be able to afford a bond as well. For me, that was the end of it. As enraged as I was, I suppose that I probably gave the same impression, and the jackals chose to attack easier prey. We were all roused Monday morning and had to shuffle outdoors to catch a bus while wearing ankle chains. We were unchained, seated, and fitted with wrist restraints there. We were driven to the courthouse following a verbal tally, where we were once more placed in a basement holding cell and ankle chain. There, we waited to be called before the assigned judge. At last, at 2 p.m. the judge's vile gaze were met by me in my rumpled clothes, stinking of the jail cell, and a 3-day shadow of my beard when the bailiffs for my court arrived to fetch me. As her lawyer recounted what she believed to be the events of Friday night, Stella sat there gloating. Your Honor, my client was tending to her own business dining out when she was traumatized by the appearance of her husband. Before he could commit bodily harm to her, the police called to the scene were able to successfully interdict before any injuries were sustained to my client. He roared with righteous rage. My lawyer surprised me by showing up and retorting that I had no such intentions. Later on, I learned that the judge's clerk had called that morning to inform him to be in court on my behalf, even though I had neglected to get in touch with him. While I was trying to quickly whisper to him what had transpired, he was repeating back to the judge everything I had told him. Mr. Perry, do you think you've learned your lesson? When I issue a restraining order and a no-contact order, I mean for you to obey them, the judge said, cutting off the lawyers after enough bickering. As I started to object, my lawyer tightly clenched my arm and growled at me to stop talking. The judge went on for a few more minutes with his tirade before deciding to order my release and cautioning me once more not to get in touch with Stella. The court was adjourned, and I observed Stella get up from her chair and leave the room with Ted Jefferson. They both looked victorious as they walked away. While the bailiffs were handcuffing me and escorting me back to the basement holding cell, my lawyer gave me some quick counsel for a few minutes. After that, we had to wait until everyone had finished court before being driven back to the jail. My personal possessions were returned to me when I was removed from the line and brought to a processing area. Forms indicating the location of my truck's tow and instructions on how to get in touch with and pay to have it released were given to me. With a sigh, I made plans to have my pickup picked up by calling the towing company as I was leaving the premises. I waited after calling a cab, since it was beyond 5 p.m. When I tried to call my supervisor, the phone went to voicemail. I made up my mind to tell him face-to-face tomorrow. I was expecting for a peaceful ride to the tow yard, but as fate would have it, I ended up with a very talkative cabbie who wanted to talk to me the whole way. I would reply to his jabbering and queries with monosyllabic responses. We drove the rest of the way in quiet as I finally told him, I'm going to start deducting your tip for every word you say to me. He finally stopped talking after that. I did feel bad for becoming angry with him, and I did give him a generous tip. After that, I enjoyed attempting to retrieve my car. The amount of bureaucratic paperwork required by the police was so overwhelming that I was taken aback by the lengths I had to go through in order to get my vehicle back. At last, I managed to satisfy them and made my way back home. The place they called home was a tiny camper trailer with a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a bedroom with running water and electricity. After taking off my clothing, I considered burning them, but ultimately decided that my wallet would have to take precedence over my pride. Right now, I didn't have the money to go out and buy new clothes. If not for the embarrassment, I would have to hope the dry cleaners could remove the odor. I went to take a steaming shower. The hot water tank suddenly ran out, so I had to finish my bath in cold water, much as I would have liked to lounge in the warm water. I went to the small bed and crawled beneath the blankets, shivering as I toweled off. As I fell asleep, I thought about how amazing my weekend had been. When morning finally arrived, I hurriedly prepared and ate a hearty breakfast of bacon and eggs. I believed I earned it after what I had gone through. The boss then publicly chastised me for missing work yesterday since I arrived at work early. I don't know who the hell you think you are, but I'm not going to put up with your fooling around and not showing up for work except when you feel like it. The charge hurt since, in the 10 years I had worked there, yesterday had been the first day I had ever missed from work outside of planned vacations. My boss persisted in his tirade, and the disturbance was gaining attention, which appeared to encourage him to say even more outrageous things. He insisted, so where the hell were you? I persisted in attempting to delay him and requested a private conversation. But he had discovered a problem that he was determined to expose and use as an example for the rest of his staff. He persisted in his questioning. I persisted in my stalling, and during the heated exchange, we were both cursing at each other. Where the hell were you? My employer questioned once more, pausing to show empathy for each word that was uttered. At last, I lost my cool. Now are you delighted that I was placed in jail by my goddamn wife? His expression of disbelief was the same as that of my colleagues. They could never have imagined that I would end up in jail. Despite this, I kept purging myself of all the hate I had been holding inside for so long. And I appreciate you going public with everything, you terrible sob. I recall having to support you after your divorce 8 years ago, and this is how you're repaying the favor. All right, fuck you. Ignore you and the steed you arrived on. I resigned, I'm sorry, sob. That being said, I turned around and walked back to the parking lot in order to get into my truck. A number of my coworkers followed me, attempting to talk me out of leaving and to come back so we could talk about everything in private with my boss. However, I was not going to be talked into it. I had been working so hard for 10 long years to support my family, and for what? Now that I was living alone, I had no idea when I would get to see my son or daughter. With nowhere to go and it being too early for the bars to be open, I returned to my camper after hearing my phone ping announcing the arrival of a new text message. Since I was driving, I chose not to take it out of my pocket and see who it was from, but I suspected it was from my boss wanting to make amends. After turning off the truck and veering over the more serious potholes into the dirt road, I took out my phone and read the text, which shocked me to see was from Stella and said, "John, I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding." I replied back to Stella before I could even think, "What were you trying to prove, Stella?" After waiting for a few hours for a response, I received a call from my friend Jerry at work, who I assumed would try to talk me out of leaving and asking for my job back. Instead, he said, "John, the police are here looking for you." I thanked him for the information and hung up, realizing once more that Stella had taken advantage of my weakness and that the police would soon be at my new address, so I could anticipate another stay in jail thanks to Stella. After giving it some brief thought, I unhooked the camper's water and electricity connections and reversed my truck up to hitch up the trailer mount. I knew I would forfeit my security deposit at the trailer park, but I needed to buy myself some time, so I did it anyway. My concerns about using a phone while driving vanished as I drove out of the trailer park with everything I owned. I called my lawyer first, and when I finally got through to him, I told him what had happened. He called me an idiot and then proceeded to chew me out. He then said he would call the court and try to get a hearing set so I could surrender in court instead of being arrested again. He warned me not to have any contact with Stella again, but I assured him I had learned my lesson. After that, I called the trailer park manager to cancel my lease. Lastly, I called my grandparents. Then I drove. I drove east for almost 100 miles to reach my destination, where I would find my maternal grandparents. My destination was Sanctuary. When I got out of the truck, they greeted me with worried expressions on their faces. They were aware of the initial extent of my problems, but telling them would make them upset just because they were worried about me. I told them about the trauma I had experienced over the weekend, and they were horrified that my relationship with Stella had gotten to the point of this toxic radioactivity. Grandma insisted on feeding me before we talked, and then I asked for a big favor. Would it be okay with y'all if I camp out here for a while until everything settles down? You know this will always be your home, my grandfather remarked, glancing at me. Simply place your camper wherever you like. And it solved one of my problems. I still didn't have any money coming in, but at least I could wait to pay the rent until I could begin to repay my grandparents. I asked them if they knew of any construction companies in the area that were hiring. They looked at my question and offered some possibilities, but it seemed like they thought that no one was hiring at the moment. That was not good news. I still had bills to pay and obligations to attend to, not the least of which was my irrational lawyer whose mood fluctuated depending on how much I was paying him on a retainer basis. After I inquired whether they knew of anyone in need of handyman work of any kind, they perked up and gave me a list of names and addresses to check out, along with a promise that they would phone their friends to acquire more leads. My grandparents suggested I could stay in the home, but I didn't want to bother them, and I was a big believer in Ben Franklin's adage that fish and overnight guests overstayed their welcome after 3 days. I spent the rest of the day jury-rigging electricity and water service to the camper. I spent the following several days contacting every construction company in the area in an attempt to find work. To my surprise, no one was recruiting, but I did get to fill out a lot of application forms, and I began to shudder at the notion of anybody calling my previous employer. The good news was that I only needed to make sure I didn't be picked up by the police before the hearing date, since my attorney had managed to get a hearing date scheduled for my second show cause hearing for breaking the no-contact order. My first job as a handyman was to raise an old barn for my grandparents' neighbor. I bid twice as much as anyone else just to knock it down, and I included hauling off all the debris. All the other estimates assumed that the job would take 2 to 3 days with a crew of workers. I finished the job in one long day, and while I was loading the last load of debris into my grandpa's flatbed trailer, the neighbor came out to greet me with 2 ice-cold long-neck bottles of beer, which I graciously accepted. We sipped away calmly, watching the last vestiges of the sunset turn into dusk. Well, John, I wasn't sure you could finish the task in a single day, but I'll be darned if you couldn't. Furthermore, you didn't use any large machines. That's why they all calculated the cost of renting equipment, which is why their bids were so high. I explained that I used heavy chains on all the support beams and that the barn collapsed like a deck of cards due to the torque of my Dodge pickup in low gear. The rest was simply a matter of heavy work gloves and a strong back lugging the old timbers into the trailer. Well, Mr. Lambert, my Dodge pickup just thinks it's a bulldozer. I'll go into town tomorrow for a tetanus shot, but right now this is all the medicine I need, I said, finishing the last sip of beer before tossing the empty into the bed of my pickup. I left Mr. Lambert's property slowly, hauling the trailer back to my grandparents' place, and tomorrow morning I would dump it at the local landfill before I went in to get my shot. We struck up a conversation because it was only polite to keep him company while he finished. The following day, I unloaded the trailer at the landfill, went to get my shot, and drove to another neighbor, where I spent the whole day using a chainsaw to chop down deadwood trees, with an assurance that the next week they would rent out a log splitter so I could split the wood into cords of firewood, and we would then talk about how much it would cost to remove all the stumps. When I did eventually return to my trailer, I was a tired puppy, and true to form, according to the theory that there was no rest for the wicked, I had a court date the following day. After getting dressed nicely, I went outside the following morning to find my grandparents, who, in a show of support, insisted on escorting me back to the city. They got their money's worth as the battle royale broke out. I was threatened with jail once more if I continued to communicate with Stella. Despite my repeated assurances that I had learned my lesson, the court scheduled a hearing for the divorce, property settlement, and child visitation and custody. After we left court, my grandma headed straight to Stella, ignoring the warning not to stir up trouble. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Stella Perry, for what you did. You cheating on John was bad enough, but now you're attempting to have him locked up. And why did you fabricate those tales about him harming the children and you? You are fully aware that he would never hurt any of you and that he loved you and his children with all of his heart. Not letting John see his kids is a sin and a crime." Stella, to her credit, blushed with embarrassment when my little grandmother confronted her. She and her beau, Ted Jefferson, waited uneasily for the elevator to arrive so they could be taken to the lobby and out of the reach of my enraged grandmother. The humiliation escalated until Stella and Ted retreated down the stairway to make their escape. The assembled audience gave my grandmother a small round of applause for the entertainment value. I studied the court dates the judge had prescribed as we stepped into the elevator. Of the 3 court hearing dates, seeing my kids was my top priority. Stella's allegations had prompted the state's Child Protection Office to become involved, and now I had to worry about some misguided social worker having the authority to keep my kids away from me. I was only allowed to see my kids on occasion, under the supervision of a social worker, at a neutral site with my 10-year-old son, Stephen, and my 8-year-old daughter, Carol, until the matter was resolved. The happiness I experienced when my kids ran toward me after every visit was equaled by the pain I felt when the social worker gently escorted them away while they pitifully exclaimed, "Daddy, Daddy," as they departed. I would clumsily stumble to my truck and cry hysterically within the cab for the next few hours. How was Stella able to harm us in this way? I thought about how fortunate I had been to wed her. For over a decade, she had been the source of love and happiness in my life. She had bestowed upon me the world's most wonderful children. We weren't wealthy, but we also weren't indigent. Both of us were employed and faced the typical challenges of sticking to a budget. Overall, though, I felt content and at ease with life. However, a wolf was standing at the door. Ted Jefferson, a prosperous businessman, was drawn to Stella inexplicably, and he methodically and mercilessly laid out his plan to entice her. How long it took was unknown to me. All I could feel was a slow, steady thawing of my passion and love for Stella. Her constant resistance to making love to me was starting to confuse me. We intended to have 3 kids when we got married, but nowadays, if I brought it up, I would get one excuse after another. I eventually gave up on the topic and chose to accept my 2 lovely children as is, which I didn't mind since we were getting ready for all the things that teenagers do. Baseball, football, and even soccer, where I clenched my teeth, swimming, ballet, and piano. I supported them in whatever caught their interest because I believed that a variety of pursuits would result in a well-rounded young person. As they grew older, they were able to concentrate on the select few things they were really good at. Stella and I had worked up a calendar to make sure they could all make their appointments. Gradually, I started to observe a pattern wherein I assumed the role of principal driver and Stella would excuse herself citing business meetings. The frequency and duration of the meetings increased. Stella would become angry with me and remark that I wanted to keep her in the kitchen, barefoot, and pregnant whenever I complained to her. As we navigated these dangerous periods in our marriage, I eventually learned to swallow my pride and bite my tongue. Stella got into the habit of reading before bed, so I immediately shot down any hopes I had for us bonding over makeup before bed. I tried to get her to respond to me physically, but she shot me down. I would flip over, puzzled and irritated, my back to her. However, it went beyond that. I also missed our late-night conversations in bed when it was still dark outside. I loved those moments just as much as our intimate moments together. My dearest friend started to get missed. On another front, hostilities were building. I could hear her and the kids constantly complaining about how impoverished we were and how they had to make do. The ridiculous claims shocked me. I asked Stella what was missing from her life especially, and continued bringing up everything I had done for them. Ted Jefferson was the person who answered that specific inquiry. I learned 6 months later. I understand your thoughts. All the signs were right there in front of me. Every single obvious sign of an affair. As much as I loved and trusted Stella, the truth is that I was completely unaware of this until the day. What a day that was, boy. That Saturday morning, Stephen and Carol were supposed to have soccer practice. As Stephen and Carol were practicing on separate fields, I was cheering them on from the soccer complex's bleachers. Many families and parents were doing similar actions for their children. I recognized the woman sitting next to me as our preacher's wife, Donna Richards. She grinned, and we started discussing our children. It was a nice talk with just the proper amount of guilt for not attending church every week. Both Donna and her husband, I'm sure, had to cope with people who shared a similar guilty conscience. It was such a lovely morning, she said, and what were my plans? I informed her that I would have to mow the lawn after practice and that the kids and I would grab a cheeseburger. With a furrowed brow, Donna informed me that she had overheard on the radio about an impending severe weather front, with rain expected for the remainder of the weekend. That didn't make me glad to hear. I had neglected to mow the yard for a week already, and it was in poor condition. Dude, I wish you hadn't threatened to sell my hide to Stella if I didn't get the yard cut. I insisted that she take the two $20 bills I offered to pay for everyone's meal, and as I was leaving, I took one last look at the practice fields, trying to see Stephen and Carol swirling among the kids. Donna laughed and offered a solution. She would watch the kids, take them with her kids to grab a bite after practice, and then drop them off at the house. I thought it was one of Stella's friend's cars since it was parked in our driveway and I was in a hurry to get home. After pulling into our carport, I opened the utility door and took out the lawnmower. It started up with the first crank, and I marched back and forth across the lawn until I reached the fifth pass, at which point the front door opened and a stranger came out of the house and headed toward the car, studiously ignoring me as he fumbled to get his key in the door lock and jumped in, firing up the vehicle, backing out of our drive quickly, and speeding down the street despite my yells of hey, to halt and catch his attention. After turning off the lawnmower, I went inside. Stella was nowhere to be found downstairs, so I hurried upstairs, calling out for her when she didn't respond. As soon as I reached our bedroom door, the bathroom door opened, bringing us together, but our gazes were fixed on a small piece of clothing that was lying on the floor, a pair of Stella's underwear, a rumpled bed, and Stella with smudged makeup and hair. When I finally snapped out of my fugue state, it was around noon. Stella was gone. Who knows where? The lawnmower had idled until it finally ran out of gas. Donna had not arrived with Carol and Stephen, and I had slumped against the wall and slowly slid down it, hyperventilating from my discovery. I had no idea what to do. I just knew that I had to take care of my kids first. Eventually, the kids came and asked where Mom was, and I had no idea what to tell them. No matter how many times I tried to call her cell phone, Gloom stayed in the house for the remainder of the weekend, and even though they eventually came to terms with the fact that I didn't know any more about their mom than they did, it didn't stop those worried looks on their faces. I got the kids dressed and sent them off to school on Monday, but if I had known what was going to happen, I would have taken a different action to prevent the near future from coming to blows. When I got to work, it was painful to focus and think about Stella at the same time. When lunchtime arrived, I sat with my coworkers while they ate and joked around, staring at the paper bag that held my sandwich, which I ended up throwing away. The afternoon labor was no better, and as I was leaving the construction site, a man approached me and asked if I was John Perry. When I replied in the affirmative, he handed me a thick manila envelope and said, "Served with what?" I asked. He said, "Served with what?" I replied. He told me to read the paperwork. I opened the package and began to try to understand the legal jargon. It's amazing how these racket lawyers can create a system that makes you dependent on them. Some terms that caught my attention were solo custody, restraining order, divorce, and alimony. Since I couldn't understand any of this, I called a friend of mine who had gone through a similar situation a few years prior. When I explained why I was calling, he gave me the number of his cousin, an attorney, who would kindly wait after hours to meet me at his office. That extra service alone would have eaten up a whole week's wages, but eventually I found out how Stella and Ted could afford to spend that kind of money because they had to rush filing and serving me so rapidly. Nevertheless, there I was in the lawyer's office, observing him from behind his desk as he went through the documents I brought him, making notes, and then he started asking me a ton of questions before breaking the bad news to me. "John, this is going to be one of the worst cases I've ever seen. I've been practicing law for 10 years. The first thing to note is that someone had to pay a significant amount of overtime for those lawyers to work on the weekend if your wife was able to hire a firm of cunning and cold-blooded snakes like Faraday's firm. They were able to file and serve you on the Monday following your discovery of your wife's infidelity. Next, a judge has already signed the restraining order petition during an ex parte hearing. That was obvious after learning what you were accused of doing to your wife and children. They claim that over the course of your marriage, you physically abused your wife and mistreated her mentally as well as your children. Your wife worries about her safety, etc., etc. This is the no-contact order, which you must abide by unless the court lifts it. Restraining order preventing you from seeing your wife and any young children until the court gives permission. You are only permitted to get 500 yards or less from them or your home according to such restraining order. No correspondence via email, letters, or deliveries from outside parties. Ask to have your visiting privileges suspended, or, alternatively, arrange for supervised visits at a neutral site that won't last longer than an hour. Sole custody request made. Make a request for your wife to be given the house. In light of the unique circumstances of this case, ask the court to grant your wife lifetime alimony at 3 times the state minimum. Because of the unique circumstances of the case, ask that your wife be given full possession of the marital estate. And on and on and on. He raised the documents above his head. You also got a request for psychological evaluations on your children at your expense. He murmured, she is plumb pissed at you. Can we battle all this nonsense? I begged in despair, I just want to know when I can see my kids. Hey, John, you can always fight it. The issue will be your ability to pay for it. They're going to swamp you with documents and attorney fees. They will drag you out and battle you on every point until you run out of money or give up. And that was pretty much it. I had to have a hearing before I could get the court to order that my clothes and personal belongings be given back. And even then, her attorneys insisted on having a month to go over my inventory. I thought I could ride out the divorce in an apartment, but that would cut too much into the money I needed to fight for custody. A buddy of mine had an old small trailer that he only used during deer season, and he was willing to let it go for $3,000. I found the cheapest trailer park around, and while it helped, it still did not staunch the tide of money needed for expert testimony and legal fees. At least the court denied their request. The one that broke my heart was the court agreeing to limited supervised visitations until the final disposition. That's why I was so open to Stella's meeting proposal. I figured that if we could at least work out a solution with Carol and Stephen, or at worst make amends, get treatment, and I would have my family back. Her modest plot paid off in ways even she could not have predicted. I was living in a little, rundown trailer on my grandparents' land. I had to relocate. I was losing my job, and I was becoming more and more in debt from legal fees. When the court finally decided on Carol and Stephen's custody, the judge considered all of that. Since I was no longer a resident of the court's jurisdiction, I could not support my 2 small children and myself with a living space, and as a result, the court decided that Stella Perry would receive sole custody. In addition, the court decided that it was in the best interests of the children for the father's visitation to remain restricted to 1 hour of supervised visitation within the court's jurisdictional boundaries. This visitation will start on the second Saturday of every month due to the previously mentioned reason and the abuse allegations. Why wasn't the court listening to my children? Despite all the efforts by Stella's experts, none of them could get Stephen or Carol to say anything bad about me. The resentment I felt sitting watching Stella celebrating her victory with Ted Jefferson and their team of lawyers plummeted me to the darkest depth a human being could endure. To keep me away from my children. How could she? How could the court believe all those lies? When my shoes echoed through the empty courthouse hallways and I came face to face with justice, I knew for sure that she was deaf and blind. I had to wait for the entire courtroom to empty before I could go. I fought the good fight as long as I could, but it was inevitable. Stella would have the use of the marital residence until Carol turned 18, at which point it would be sold and the proceeds divided equally. But guess who was still paying the mortgage? Child support. Alimony. Acceptance of all debts incurred during the marriage. The assets were so pitiful that I essentially walked out of town with my Dodge pickup and trailer. I literally left town with my tail between my legs, thinking alternately that at least they would have to burn gas to come get me when I couldn't afford everything, and that I would do everything in my power to avoid getting to the point where they would have to come get me. I was working 12 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, with the exception of the second Saturday of the month, which I marked in red on my calendar. When that Saturday finally arrived, I drove quickly down the highway to the location where the visit was scheduled to happen, arriving with 2 hours to spare and waiting impatiently for them to arrive. The social worker arrived 30 minutes ahead of time, and we positioned ourselves in neutral corners of the room, biding our time as the minutes passed. After 15 minutes, the social worker concluded that they would not be arriving and suggested that we leave. I declined, explaining that they were simply running late. After 45 minutes, she recommended that I call my former partner to inquire about the reason for the delay. I attempted to clarify that this wasn't a feasible solution, but she insisted on getting the number and made the call using her phone. The social worker packed up her belongings to leave, and I begged her to stay for the last 20 minutes. Oh, was that supposed to be today? Gosh, they had miscalculated and they were at the zoo in Dallas. Well, they would make sure that mistake didn't happen again. Stella responded. I stayed rooted, watching every second ticking away in the countdown until the minute hand finally clicked on 12. Then I picked up all the little gifts I was able to buy and carry for the visit and carried them back to the truck for the long, quiet drive back home. That was the look she gave me. You poor sad sob. Stella objected to my request for an alternate day, claiming it would be too disruptive for plans that had already been made. So the court's response was exactly what I expected. He would overlook it this once, but please make sure it doesn't happen again. I returned and worked hard for another month to make sure all the payments were made on time. On Saturday, I paced the room, waiting for Carol and Stephen to arrive. When they finally did, I collapsed into a hug, sobbing with happiness as we rocked back and forth. Then, in an attempt to make the most of every moment, I asked them how they were doing. And so, through a figment of my imagination, I learned of Stella's happenings with reference to the children. They were gone from the house, having relocated across town to live in a huge, beautiful house with their Uncle Ted. Some people had moved into our old house, paying mommy rent to live there. I felt like 1,000 tiny cuts as I kept smiling for the kids, letting them tell me all the innocent things they had done. I reached for the gift bags I brought back from the last month's fiasco, waiting expectantly to see the smiles on their faces. Stephen picked through his and said Uncle Ted had bought them both iPads and iPods. Uncle Ted was buying them all kinds of toys and taking them places with Mommy. And Mommy was so happy and smiling and laughing all the time. When the social worker informed us that we only had 5 minutes left, I kept a frozen clown smile on my face and grabbed them both, holding them and telling them over and over again how much I loved them until finally it was time for them to go. Even though I knew I could never compete with Ted Jefferson on that level, my heart broke. I carried Stephen's present bag with me after they left because I noticed he hadn't taken it with him. As I stepped outside, I noticed Carol's gift bag lying on top of a trash can that Stella had left. I just glanced at it before walking over to stack Stephen's on top of Carol's and heading back to my pickup. I would meet the same miserable end month after month as my children gradually withdrew from my care. I began to feel an undercurrent of resentment from the kids for having to see their father. The more I tried to hold on, the more they withdrew. Then came a visit where, at the conclusion, Stephen asked me for a favor. I smiled and said sure. He informed me that Ted had tickets to the University of Texas Longhorns game scheduled for the same day for the following month's visit. Would it be okay if he and Carol skipped that month's visit? It became easier and easier for Stephen or Carol or both to let me know they preferred to be somewhere other than with me during the visits. As Carol told me when I tried to put up a resistance, "It's not like you're really our daddy anymore." I stammered sure it was okay. The next visit we had they could tell me all about it. Stephen reluctantly allowed me to hug him as they walked away. I should have been furious, extremely furious, take no prisoners furious, but all I felt was numbness. "Stephen, do you feel that way? Have you had enough of my visits?" "Yes," Stephen nodded, bowing his head. "There was only one last thing to ask. Do you guys want to discontinue having visits?" My two children lowered their heads and gave a nod of approval. I paused for a moment, but neither child would meet my gaze. "All right, this is the last visit. Though I won't be expecting you to be here, I will continue to drive up in case one of you decides to change their mind." I whispered, "I wish you could only know how much I love you both and how much I'll miss you." I walked out first for the one and only time, and lo and behold, I ran into Stella outside waiting to pick up the kids. I could tell she was freaking out, her damn 500-yard buffer zone not worth a screw to her in that very moment. I just looked at her and said, "You won." And I was gone. My son was Ted's best man, my girl was a little bridesmaid, and the wedding announcement appeared in all the local papers. I called my lawyer for what I believed to be the final round of representation, instructing him to seek the sale of our marital residence and file for reconsideration of the alimony. At last, the court decided to agree with me and terminate the alimony. After we proved that the marriage residence had been turned into a rental, the court mandated that I receive the remaining amount when the house sold. This was far too little, too late. I celebrated by going to my trailer and going on a week-long drinking spree. I was just getting back to normal when there came a knock on my trailer door. When I opened the door, I saw empty beer cans tumbling down at the feet of Robert Lambert, the neighbor of my grandparents, who hired me to tear down his old barn for my first job. He asked if I might stop by his place tomorrow after taking a look at the sloppy mess I had become. He was going to make me a business offer. I assured him that I would, and I spent the entire trailer buried under the leftover debris. Feeling ashamed with myself, I went and gathered all the cans and proceeded to tidy the trailer to the best of my ability. After that, I made sure I had a change of clean clothes, showered, and shaved. I apologized to him for yesterday, Mr. Lambert, and I shook his hand when I got there at the scheduled time. As he walked me inside, he reminded me that he'd said I should call him Robert. We entered his den and saw a woman reclining on the couch towards the coffee table. She was looking through a number of maps, then typing on a laptop. She projected an austere conduct that I couldn't help but notice. Her rust-colored hair was firmly secured in a bun. Her face was pressed into a focused expression as she wore big reading glasses. Her flawless skin and absence of cosmetics did not mask her appealing features. She looked extraordinarily tall for a woman, I thought. I couldn't help but imagine how insane it would feel to kiss her and look directly into those bright blue eyes. Her body was adorned with a baggy Texas A&M sweatshirt, and her slacks were worn and baggy, as if to cap off her determined attempt to seem ugly. She seemed to be unconcerned about making an impression on anyone. "Gail, I want you to meet John Perry." I clearly did not impress Gail, as she stared over her glasses. I went to shake her hand and, as she ignored it, I became a source of contempt because I was caught in the laser beams of those intense blue eyes. "Mr. Perry, would you excuse us?" Without waiting for a response, she stormed from the room, leaving Robert Lambert in her wake. They retired to what seemed like the kitchen, and I could hear the dispute getting louder by the minute. At the very end, I heard a woman ask, "Why do we need him?" To which Robert answered, "Because I said so." The noises were too muted to make any sense of. When they emerged, it became clear that even though there was a truce in place, a brush war could break out again at any time. "John, I'm sorry for the interruption. Let me finish introducing you to my granddaughter, Gail Lambert." Robert added, Gail is a recent graduate of Texas A&M in business agriculture, and she came to me with some very interesting news. So I'm going to let Gail take over now. Gail smiled briefly, but her eyes did not match the smile. Mr. Perry, what do you know of Shreveport, Louisiana? If you don't mind, why don't you call me John? As to your question, not much. I know they have a racetrack at Bossier City and some casinos over there. I asked her to call me by my first name, but she disregarded me and said, let me rephrase the question. Mr. Perry, do you know anything about the history of Shreveport? No, I'm not, I answered. Have you ever heard of Captain Henry Shreve, Mr. Perry? My response, after researching it, was, no, can't say I have. What about the Great Raft, Mr. Perry? Have you ever heard of it? I said, wasn't that the Kon-Tiki boat that Thor what's his name sailed? The woman rolled her eyes at the response, clearly frustrated. No, Mr. Perry, the Red River formed a logjam about 800 years ago, and during all those centuries, trees found in the river continued to float down and become part of it. At its peak, the logjam stretched 150 miles upstream and became so thick that it caused the formation of numerous streams, tributaries, and lakes. You could actually walk on the river for miles without ever seeing any water. Remember, this continued for millennia. As you can guess, many of those trees eventually lost their buoyancy and plummeted to the bottom of the Red River or whatever stream it caught on at the logjam. The Red River was eventually made navigable by Captain Shreve, who was eventually given the responsibility of removing the logjam. As a result, the town of Shreveport was named in his honor. I spoke up. That is a very interesting history lesson, ma'am, but I understood this was a business meeting. So why is this important? Mr. Perry, have you ever seen lumber made from water-stained wood? It is exquisite and, more importantly, expensive. And my grandfather and your grandparents are sitting on a gold mine. The information regarding my grandparents and Robert Lambert's property along the Red River gradually dawned on me. The amount of timber that had been buried throughout time was impossible to estimate when you included in all the tributaries, lakes, and marshes. Yes, the Red River was being dredged continuously, but that would be the primary route. Who knew what lay in the dark depths off to the sides? Okay, this sounds very intriguing, but how do you propose to get to this gold? I responded. Robert said, that's where you and I come in, John. I'll pay the money to buy a big pontoon boat with 3 winches. Gail will mark out the places where there are most likely to be sunken timbers. You will pilot and dive on the timbers, hooking the winch chains onto them. After a timber is up, it will be cradled between the pontoons and brought ashore. We'll jury-rig a crane to load the timbers onto a log truck so they can be driven to a sawmill that I had built where you demolished the old barn. There is no knowing how much money we can get out of this if it is handled properly. From there, it will be cut into lumber, and we will sell either wholesale or retail depending on the profit margin. I said, okay, Robert, what is the split? Before Robert could say anything, Gail said, you get 10%. Robert retorted angrily, no, Gail, I told you we were going to be fair about this. John, for providing all the sweat equity you get 50%. Gail and I will share the remaining 50%. Gail Lambert looked like she was about to bite her nails over her grandfather's recent treachery. For the remainder of the evening, she kept giving me the stare while Robert and I talked about what we would need for the boat. After concluding that we had covered every possible scenario involving the equipment, I bid them good night. As I left, I descended the steps, Gail following close behind and standing on the porch. Mr. Perry, I pivoted and glanced up at her, and even as she arrogantly glanced down at me, her potential beauty struck me once more. I just want to say, Mr. Perry, that I am not on board with you being partners with my grandfather and I. As far as I see, we are giving away money to have you on this venture. And as far as I am concerned, the day my grandfather realizes you are just baggage will be a happy day. I lit in on her, but it must have been a reaction to everything that was going on. Ms. Lambert, I was willing to give you the benefit of the doubt, but coming out here and treating me like a dog is the last straw. I don't know who pissed in your cereal, and I don't care. I came into your house at your grandfather's invitation, and you have been a total bee the entire time. I'm tired of people putting down on me, and if you even for a second think that I'm going to let you do the same, you've got another thing coming. You have no idea who I am as a person or what I've been through. She was staring at me with her mouth open as I hurried off. I guess to let Robert know how badly I had treated her. I began to question what it was about me that annoyed women. I assumed I would soon discover whether Robert was still open to being a partner. If not, I would have to keep working so hard to make ends meet. Robert told me nothing when I got there the following morning, and the only clue that anything had happened during the previous night's tete-a-tete was a fleeting view of a red-headed specter wearing a Texas A&M t-shirt slamming her bedroom door shut. Robert and I exchanged a startled look and waited for the sound of the door slamming to stop before we both smiled like junior high school boys. We laughed that off and went on to talk about what we would need for our sawmill and how we would transport the wood. Several times, we heard the door open, and we quickly immersed ourselves in the paperwork as Gail proceeded with her mission. I remarked that she was really devoted to her school the last time she went back into her room. Robert remarked that she has worn a Texas Aggie shirt every day since returning home. I've known people who were ardent supporters of their colleges, but Gail didn't seem like that to me. We refitted the boat and got it ready for a trial voyage in less than a week. We would wait to start building the sawmill until we were certain the project was feasible. Robert could resell most of the equipment and not lose too much money if we were unable to dredge out enough timber to make it viable. However, I would keep accruing losses from missing a day's pay until my finances collapsed. I really wanted this business to succeed and start providing me with some breathing room. Robert made the decision to work in secret on a tiny tributary after speaking with Gail. I was taken aback by the signals that Gail was accompanying us when I showed up the following morning. She was packing the stuff she planned to tote in the bed of my pickup, wearing yet another A&M shirt. In order to launch the pontoon boat, we all loaded up and drove to the appropriate location. Gail remained silent during the entire conversation while sitting in the back. I killed the motor after taking the boat for a brief ride. As we drifted slowly, I reached into the boat for the big bamboo pole I had and began probing the water with it. 5 minutes later, we sensed a firm bottom, so we anchored the boat. The water was shallow enough for my mask and snorkel to operate, but I did have my old dive gear from when I was in the service. I went into the dark depths, feeling the slimy texture of a huge object as I felt my way down the bottom. I measured the girth and it was larger than my arm span as I touched along the curvature. After that, I hastily conducted a horizontal exploration and calculated the length to be around 60 feet. We found our first log, so I returned to the surface and alerted Gail and Roger. I dove again as they excitedly ran the line from one of the winches. I managed to wrap the winch wire around the log and connected the two ends together. Subsequently, I emerged once more and got onto the boat. I started bringing the line in by gently and slowly turning on the winch. We noticed the boat sinking more into the sea as the winch kept straining when the slack caught up. The boat soon started to dip in the bow and rise unstable at the stern. Robert and Gail didn't have much boating experience. I used to love taking bass boat fishing trips when I was a teenager. However, I had never attempted to land something so large. Even though this was a new application, my expertise operating heavy gear in my construction job offered me a hint as to how to handle it. The boat was still angled downward, and Robert and Gail seemed nervous. Although I wanted to provide confidence, I was also. The winch's line effortlessly rolled in as the inert suction holding the log to the bottom suddenly failed. Gail laughed heartily as the tip of the wood emerged in the sunshine for the first time in countless years, and a look of expectation lit up her face. I was in the water again, prepared to run the second line around the log, which was now leaned away from the riverbed at an angle. I threw the winch line beneath the logs and then swam over to the other side to attach it. I descended to the surface once more and took possession of the second winch. The second winch line came up easily because the log was no longer lodged in the riverbed, and soon we had our first log fastened to the boat. Robert and I shook hands and gave each other pats on the back since it was truly reason to celebrate. Robert and Gail shared a chuckle and an embrace, and then I kind of stood awkwardly next to each other until we drifted apart. We discovered that we had dug up a cypress tree as I carefully navigated the boat toward the shallow part of the water next to the ramp. That was one of the more sought-after woods, Gail explained. That day, we kept going outside until we had 5 cypress trees that were ready to be hauled and harvested. We spoke about what to do next as we traveled back. As the ice began to melt, Gail spoke with Robert about business-related matters. We made the decision that I would take the boat right to the location in the morning and carry on with the log harvesting. After buying the logging truck, Robert and Gail would transport it to the riverbank. The logs would be placed into the log trailer using a loading arch, winches, log tongs, and chains. We would then deliver our first load to an operational sawmill and sell it. With that first investment, we would start building our own sawmill. I drove back to the lake before morning and launched the boat right before it got light. I returned to the lake after finding the first log, not realizing how cold the water would be at that early hour. I made myself finish fastening up the log so I could get it ashore. I quickly ran to my truck, switched on the heater, and let it fight the early symptoms of hypothermia. It was obvious that there were still some things to learn about gathering logs. Fortunately, the neoprene wetsuit I was wearing still fit until I realized I had brought my scuba gear with me. It could withstand the edge of the freezing water till the sun or the truck heater warmed me up. 10 more logs had joined our loot by the time Robert and Gail with the vehicle arrived. I retracted the truck and fastened the chains and tongs to help the arch raise the timbers onto the vehicle. Though laborious and ineffective, it was the least expensive method of loading until our company's size made employing a log crane justifiable. Robert and Gail watched me work because I was the only one with sufficient experience. I heard Robert ask Gail whether she still felt I wasn't needed for the operation as I was chaining the final log. I was relieved to be silent, as Gail was still hardly able to stand me. I had loaded enough logs for the first load at last. The rest of the logs remained in the shallow water, waiting to be loaded onto the second load. I maneuvered the logging truck to the sawmill where our anticipated buyer was waiting and where we had arranged to discharge the logs. As we got closer to the lodge yard, Gail and Robert passed me in the car. The buyer weighed and examined the trailer before presenting me with an offer that I could live with. That's where I witnessed Gail prove her worth. She informed the customer of the current pricing and the fact that supply is still not keeping up with demand. Furthermore, the slope and size of the logs we had transported were not factored into the current pricing. Our logs would yield twice as many board feet for the buyer, thus the buyer would have to make the appropriate payment. They kept joking about until they got to a point where both Robert and I were suitably impressed. A meeting was scheduled to examine the second shipment I would deliver, and the buyer was supposed to have a check ready for us. Eager to get the second load on the trailer and into the log yard, I hurried back. Because of the huge pay disparity, I was able to tolerate Gail as a necessary evil. All I could do was hope that she would come to the same decision as me. My comment: he should have told Stella that she was responsible for her kids and leave them in her care. His kids hated him, so why would he care about them? He should have recorded her comments about lying in court about he abusing her so he could sue Ted for all of his money. Part 2 ending coming today as well. I tried to keep it a tad longer in the video so you guys don't need to watch so many separated parts. If you enjoyed this, subscribe and I will see you in the ending.